Okay.
Excellent. Good evening, Sarah.
Good evening, Gavin. It's very weird to hear you and not see you. You're just sort of booming around the room.
Sorry, I don't mean to boom too much, but perhaps you can do the booming now from now on. And perhaps you could tell us what it's like in Berlin right now and why you're there.
Berlin. Okay, so the reason I'm in Berlin is I think you were speaking about it a bit actually just with Laura. It's the Terrorism Act in the UK, specifically Schedule 7. So the UK really is having what I think is a large crackdown on press freedoms. The Terrorism Act is under the Terrorism Act that the intelligence services went into the Guardian offices and destroyed their hard drives. It's what they used to detain David Miranda, and it's this Schedule 7 that means my lawyers have advised me not to go home. The problem with Schedule 7 is that you are compelled to answer questions. You have no right to silence. So because of my work with Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, my lawyers are certain that I would be detained under Schedule 7. And then because of our work with source protection, there would be questions that I would refuse to answer. This then means that you're committing a crime under the Terrorism Act. Now, the biggest problem with this is not just the 3 months that you would then potentially face in jail, but also the fact that you're then a convicted terrorist. And obviously that has large implications for no-fly lists and huge problems afterwards. David Miranda is actually appealing the legality of this law being used against journalists and journalistic work. That's due in courts in the spring. And I think that it would be great if there was a large campaign within the UK to say that this law shouldn't be used against journalists and to try and ring fence and keep press freedoms. There was actually some legal advice that was given to the government that actually stated that it would be quite easy to ring fence to make a change to this law so that press freedoms were protected. So they understand that it's easy to do, and hopefully if there was a campaign leading up to Miranda's case, we can change the law and keep press freedoms within the UK.
Terrific. I mean, what has it been like actually working in Berlin for you? Is it entirely different than you'd expected?
I mean, Berlin's a great city, and I'm really thankful to everyone here that sort of, helped us. In no small part, the Wow Holland Foundation. I think you've been hearing from Bernd and Andy, who were on the board there today. They have been longtime supporters of WikiLeaks. They helped us through the banking blockade quite heavily. They collect money for us after the US government put pressure on organizations like PayPal, Visa, MasterCard to shut off our donations. So I've really had the support of them and many, many people here in Berlin. And luckily, for a lot of the work, as long as there's a good internet connection, then I can continue to work.
Mm. The Courage Foundation, which you're now running, could you tell us something about it?
You're a trustee of, Gavin.
I am apparently am. Yes, that's right. Tell us something about it.
So we started up the Courage Foundation after our work getting Edward Snowden asylum. Basically, it was an interesting case there where we found that of all the organizations that were supportive, the ability to actually act fast and have protections and the technical know-how to assist Snowden, and also to do things like quickly setting up a bank account that could collect donations. Obviously, in such a contentious case, many people were worried about the ability to do this, particularly with the precedent of the banking blockade against WikiLeaks behind as a precedent. So we saw that there was a need, and hence we started up Courage, which basically is kind of it's a whistleblower support organization, but it's the sort of the unique part about Courage is that it's not only global, but also is being set up and designed specifically for these high-risk cases to really help in sort of some of the most dangerous circumstances of whistleblowers and to get them the help that they need.
Were you asked at any point, either in Russia or anywhere en route in Hong Kong, your relationships with other organizations, or were you immune from that, at least for that trip?
What do you mean, my relationships with who? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
No, just whether, for example, when you arrived there and when you had any dealings when you left, did anybody question why you were there and what you were doing?
Well, I'm quite lucky that, and I think it's one of the reasons why we succeeded in Hong Kong, is that our boss, Julian Assange, has a very large background and experience, not just in encryption and encryption methods, but actually in sort of entire security systems, and really understands these things very well, and has trained us not just in how to let's say communicate using encryption, but also in entire methods of operational security, both on and offline. I also know Hong Kong quite well, so one of the sort of reasons we were able to be successful in Hong Kong was actually the fact that we know how to sort of operate quite under the radar and off the grid. So I managed to avoid sort of questions really in any sense whilst I was in Hong Kong. In Moscow, in the airport, we were just sort of alone in a transit zone. We managed to avoid the press, who I think dearly would have loved to ask questions.
How long were you in the Moscow airport?
We were in the airport for 40 days.
Were you actually sleeping on the benches, or what? How did you manage it?
No, we found somewhere. The journalists were sleeping on the benches. That was actually quite funny because we were booked on the next leg of the flight that we were meant to take was actually to Cuba on an Airflot flight, and this information got out to the press, which flight we were meant to be on, and so a lot of them actually booked tickets on that flight in sort of the hope that Ed would be on there and they would sort of be able to, I guess, surround him and harass him. And of course, because the US cancelled his passport, we were unable to board that flight. Now, what you may not know is that Airflot actually have, on pretty much all of their flights, they don't sell alcohol. And being a seasoned journalist, Gavin, I'm sure you can imagine what a press are like on a very long flight without any alcohol and without the story that they all bought their tickets for.
Quite right, too. I'm sure they blamed you for this.
They blame us for a lot, so it wouldn't surprise me.
Well, listen, we have time for questions. Let me open the floor up if you're happy to take some, and
yeah,
we'll see what's going on here. Ooh.
Okay, maybe I may ask the first question.
The first one from Caroline.
Hi, my name is Caroline. Hi. I want to ask you, John Pilger was earlier giving here a really impressive speech. And he was also pointing out in the current state of affairs of all of us, where we don't want to know what's happening, a lot of airbrushing is happening. And one of the things he was addressing that actually Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are airbrushed towards Snowden and Greenwald. Is that something you relate to, or you don't feel that? He was referring to the Alternative Nobel Prize winning last week.
What do you mean by airbrush?
Airbrushed out. Sort of airbrushed out.
Airbrushed out.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I mean, I think that there has been a lot of, and what I don't really sort of see it as particularly helpful or at all correct, in that people like to try and draw these comparisons and you know, who's better or who's, you know, achieved more, etc. I think actually, particularly if you look at the case of Snowden and Assange, it's kind of a weird one because they're completely different beings. Ed Snowden is a whistleblower. Julian Assange is actually a journalist and a publisher. So I sort of don't understand why people try and make those comparisons. I think Snowden did a heroic act, and I think that Julian's sort of life work and his starting of WikiLeaks, but also the work that he did before then shows great bravery. And so I think that people, when they try to draw these comparisons, it's actually more to do with their own sort of maybe misgivings or the fact that they're listening and playing into the government rhetoric too much.
Thank you very much. Here's a new question.
Second over here. There we are. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Saida, and I'm not really a journalist, I'm a blogger. But
well, that's all right. Puts you in good company. According to many newspapers, people like Glenn Greenwald are just bloggers, so makes everyone feel better. So
it does. The crackdown on press freedom is paralleled and less reported, the relationship between surveillance and the kind of ripping away of civil rights of a community. So in the US, they quite openly say that okay, there's a racial thing going on, but here, the kind of Muslim community kind of feels like there's a civil rights crackdown going on. And it's backed up in the ways that you yourself are experiencing it as the press, but there seems to be a kind of absence of that dialogue within the press. I'm not hearing stories about this civil rights crackdown on the Muslim community, and I was wondering if you knew where that gap's coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I completely sort of see what you're referring to. I think that one of the biggest issues in this is the government in the UK and the US as well. They like to use this sort of rhetoric of national security, terrorism, etc., to basically as propaganda tools to give them a cover to operate in many sorts of abusive ways. I think if you're looking at, for example, the Muslim community, the crackdowns aren't really noticed or seen because they're by so many people in the press or the public at large, because the government has kind of tried to create a trail and a narrative that these sorts of things are necessary for the security of everybody. And I don't think that this is actually questioned enough. I mean, if you look at, for example, the statements that the US government said about us when we released the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war logs, they tried to say that we had blood on our hands, which is quite an extraordinary thing when we're exposing the tens of thousands of deaths by the US government and at their hands, and we, just for publishing some information, have this statement twisted round and thrown back at us. And I think that is all sort of part of the same trend where to try to say, oh no, we have to surveil on you, we have to break your rights, we have to go and invade another country around the world. This is all done under this sort of guise of national security, and it's really created problems within the UK and the US communities and media on how to deal with Muslim communities, and to understand that it is not okay for anybody's rights to be broken. And I think, again, it's just bowing to what the US government and the UK governments want. For example, like with the D notices, etc. I think that the press in the UK really needs to grow some balls for the most part.
Quite right. Jeremy, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah. It's Jeremy.
Oh, Jeremy, how are you?
Fine. You are amazing, and this had to be said. You're an example for so many of us, and so many of us love you deeply. You know that.
I love you too, Jeremy.
In one sentence, you mentioned the Schedule 7 of terrorist act being used against journalists, and in some other sentence earlier, you mentioned journalist and journalistic work. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it. And in homage to the previous question of the blogger, neither Greenwald nor Laura has been trained as a journalist, nor Julian, nor many of the people actually doing the great journalistic work today. We could trace many parameters in the way media groups are being merged depending on advertisement and all the legal blockades here and there. My question here is, what would you advise to people in this audience who may actually be working in media groups and be frustrated about it. Do you think there is a way to change things from inside, and how? Or should they just get the fuck away and do something on their own with the internet?
You mean within sort of mainstream media organizations?
Yes. Yes, exactly.
I think that there is, you bring up an interesting point about the sort of institutions, and I think that it's with many organizations, whether it be mainstream media or organizations like the NSA, there is this sort of problem of institutionalism, which is sort of difficult to break out of. I don't necessarily think, for example, within the mainstream media, it's necessarily a lost cause per se, but I do think that one of the beauties of the internet is that anybody can start publishing and writing online. I would say that if you're a journalist in a mainstream media organization, then you should do the work that you think is correct and you think is right. And if you, as you will see with some of Glenn's trajectory, if you feel that at any point you're being prevented, your pieces are being too editorialized, if you want to publish a story that the media organization doesn't have the guts for, then at that point you should not only just go it alone, but make some noise about it so that the public understand how that media organization is filtering the information that they publish.
Yeah, good one, thanks. Here's another one coming up.
Hi, my name is Alistair. I'm a video journalist with The Telegraph. And I just wanted to ask you, on a personal level, how does it feel that essentially your government says that you can't come home?
Well, I mean, I don't like it, obviously. I think for me, the saddest thing is the fact that the UK has had a long history of press freedoms, and this move towards clamping down on this, I find very sad that this is happening from my home country. I mean, I don't, with regards to the concept of not being able to go home. I mean, I work at an organisation where my boss has spent 2.5 years in the Ecuadorian embassy because his right to asylum is being blocked. Jeremy Hammond, for example, an alleged source of ours, is spending a decade in prison. Manning has 35 years in prison. So I suppose I'm kind of right at the bottom of the pile of the effects of people within this sort of movement and trying to do this work. So I don't think I can feel very sorry for myself, really.
Right. One more. Here we go. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name's Paul Lynch. My question is, given your sort of up-close and personal experience of the surveillance state, how do you see this playing out, both either probably on two tangents? What's, I suppose, the most positive outcome, and what do we need to do to help ensure we get to that place? And what do you see as, I suppose, the status quo or how bad it could get?
One of the most sort of personally positive outcomes of the NSA revelations is actually just the fact that, I mean, because of our work, whenever we're working on a publication, we have to use certain security and encryption methods. And every time we would get a new partner, it used to be such a battle to sort of make them understand that actually, no, this sort of is necessary. I remember, for example, going into one news organization to train them, and they couldn't actually get Tor on their computers because it was blocked by the firewall. So then we have to get the head of IT in. He's sort of refusing to get Tor into the media organization because, oh, isn't that thing that pedophiles use? And then when I try and explain the security, we ended up sort of with the editor-in-chief of the media organization, etc., and it became a huge palaver. So one of the sort of personally good things for me is that now it's quite easy when I sort of say, oh, well, we'll have to train you on some encryption methods. Most journalists are actually quite pleased to have that training. So it sort of made my life personally quite a lot easier on that sort of front. because of the work that WikiLeaks has done since the beginning, and the understanding that Julian has had of the capabilities of the NSA long before the revelations, we actually have been used to working in this environment and have been trained in these ways sort of ever since we started. So the NSA revelations haven't necessarily made a large impact on how we've had to work ourselves. People do get now that people like Julian and Jake aren't actually paranoid, they're just actually correct, which is also quite nice. I think that with regards to the how bad it could get, I mean, I think sort of total mass surveillance and complete global penetration by the NSA is sort of in a sense can't get any worse. I mean, I'm sure they can and will develop new technologies as time goes on. But I think that the general concept of how the extent of their mass surveillance is pretty total. I think that it doesn't mean that all is necessarily lost. Encryption does work. I think that the main thing is that people need to be trained and to understand the technologies so that they can protect themselves. I think that our states obviously are not sticking up for our rights to privacy there. They're not protecting and respecting us. We've seen how many governments are working with the NSA. So I think it really is up to the technical community to try and help all members of the public be able to find ways to protect themselves.
Yes. Okay, one more coming up.
Okay. Hi, I'm Alistair from Technical Tech. I had a question around how you engage with the wider public here, because I think obviously there's a huge awareness of the leaks of Snowden, of the surveillance network that's built up. But there is a sense that this is, to some degree, detached from everyday people, in the sense that you have to be a whistleblower or supporting whistleblowers or a journalist with secrets to actually get this level of persecution. How is it that we can get this information and engage people and tell them how this actually affects them? I think this is a really difficult barrier for us to get across. I think there's a sense from sort of people who are not directly involved, well, this isn't going to really affect me, terrible that it is. It's nothing to do with my life because I'm not an activist. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is sort of a bit of an uphill battle in the sense that a lot of people I've heard say, oh, okay, well, I understand that I'm being, my emails can be read, but I have nothing to hide. I think that also one of the battles in this, and it's something that organizations like yours can and do, and that's sort of just education and keeping on that. I've had conversations, for example, with some people that actually to them, it was actually just a revelation that the internet is physically carried by cables across the world. I think with sort of Wi-Fi everywhere now, people just sort of thought it was magically the internet was just sort of something in the air. So I think just understanding how it's possible that that this surveillance is happening and the manner in which it's happening needs to be a large part of that education, as well as the why should you care. I think that it's interesting actually being in Germany whilst these revelations are coming out, because there's still in living memory the history of surveillance here that was in a much more physical way. And so people, there's a bit more of an understanding here that that even if you can't see it, the concept of this surveillance, taking away of our rights is hugely problematic. I'm afraid I don't sort of have a magic answer for you, but I think just it's important not to give up.
Right, okay. I think thanks very much. I think it's great. Thanks, Sarah, very much. Thanks a lot. See you soon.